It's always really difficult to be towards the end of a conference and on a Friday afternoon. I am going to say a little bit about my own personal journey in dealing with issues of cross-cultural competence. I made a couple of notes for myself in terms of things like I often get asked to do expert witness reports, and in order to keep my feet very firmly on the ground, I remind myself that an expert is really an ex who is a has-been and a spurt who is a drip under pressure. Because there's something really important about being able to use ourselves, especially when we're talking about such an overwhelmingly complex issue as cross-cultural competence. And I have certainly found doing work with cross-cultural placements heartbreaking. I don't think I could use any other word to describe it. I think it takes a lot of courage to start to grapple with the complexities of these kinds of issues. So I'm going to, what I did is I went back and looked at the things that were important to me in my own professional development, and I'm going to share some of those with you in terms of the theoretical scaffolding that I was given to think about my journey towards a sort of modicum of cross-cultural competence. So it's interesting because I have an audible difference, which is an accent. And that's interesting in terms of how it positions me. So I'm not from here, nor am I from there. And it's interesting in terms of how I still get asked where I'm from. And just so that people aren't confused, I'm originally from Canada, not the United States of America. And it's interesting about how that becomes an entrance into a conversation about where are you from. So we're talking about notions of belonging. And if that happens to me just in relation to an audible difference in terms of my accent, imagine about visible differences and how that always can lead to questions about where are you from. And it immediately places you in a particular position vis-a-vis whoever it is that you're talking to. So I want to be mindful of that. And what's also interesting for me is I've worked with children and adults who've been in care in lots of different contexts. And one of the things that occurred to me about my audible difference is that I did a lot of psychological evaluations of Irish care survivors who were in the orphanages over here. But most of the ones that I did the assessments on were over there in the UK. And when I would ring them up to make an appointment, of course, they would hear my accent. And it was interesting about how that already positioned us to have a particular kind of conversation that I think would have been different if I didn't sound the way that I did. So it's really interesting about the little nuances that things can make. So just the way your accent, the way you look, all of that starts to activate particular ways and frames particular kinds of conversations that you might have. So the other thing I think that I wanted to touch on in thinking about that bit about audible difference, visible difference, was for people to think about the concept of passing. And so passing for the dominant group. So if I keep my mouth shut, people might not know that I'm not from here. And so there is quite a big literature about this concept of passing. And also it's connected to notions of assimilation and acculturation. And so again, there are huge bodies of research that you could be touching onto that will help us to think about what it means to join a new group, if you like, but in this case we're talking about culture. I also want to make reference to my teachers, friends, family, and colleagues who've helped me on this journey. And the one that I would like to single out really is Marcia Spencer, who was the project director for the Black Issues Project at the British Agencies for Adoption and Fostering. Marcia has passed over, sadly, far too early in her career. But she was a really tough teacher. And she had invited me once to come and speak to a majority black audience about the issue of juvenile sex offenders in the black community. And I had done my sort of talk. I was probably about halfway through at lunchtime. And in the lunch break, Marcia said to me, well, when are you going to get to the black bits about the presentation? And I remember thinking, oh gosh, I thought that I had been, so I sort of thought, oh, I'm going to have to think about this a bit more. And then when I went out to talk with the group, the first thing I said was, I was going to say, thinking back on this, I'd like to go back to some of the issues, but what I said, which is thank you to the unconscious, was thinking black on this. And of course, burst out laughing. Everybody in the audience burst out laughing, and then we moved into a different kind of discourse about what did it mean to look at theoretical material and then view it through the lens of race. And so it takes courage to sort of really start to unpick some of this material, I think. So I'm going to move now to the sort of scaffolding that I referred to. One of the things that I came across, I was a bit worried because the material's old, so hence, remember, the X has been. But I heard Terry Cross present his material on what he called his cultural competence continuum. And I personally found it really very helpful. So he talks a little bit about cultural competence as a set of behavior, attitudes, policies that come together and enable that system to work effectively in cross-cultural situations. So I think it's really a good aspiration to have, is that we develop cross-cultural competence. It assumes that culture is important, and I'm not going to talk about that. I think that can be taken as a given. But it sees cross-cultural competence as a developmental process. And so I think that that's also important, is that it's a journey for all of us. And it carries on all the way through your life, I think, really. So he put it on a continuum, and he talked about this from sort of one end, which is cultural destructiveness. Then he discussed cultural incapacity. Then he discussed cultural blindness, cultural pre-competence, and sort of advanced cultural competence, or sometimes it's called cross-cultural proficiency. And I think at any one time, in a group, you're going to have people at different positions along this continuum. And so that's important to sort of recognize, much as it might be distressing for us to think about, is that there are examples, and in particular, if we're thinking about care, where the care system is part of an overall kind of systematic cultural policy of destructiveness. So I wanted then to refer us just briefly to the Truth and Reconciliation Commission in Canada, which is called Honoring the Truth, Reconciling for the Future. Honorer la vérité, réconcilier pour l'avenir. Language. Language is important, that we have different emotional lives in our different languages. And having one of the gifts of growing up in Canada is that it's a bilingual country, and the rights to your language, to freedom of worship, is embedded in our Constitution. So at the beginning of the Truth and Reconciliation executive summary, they talked about the residential schools were created for the purpose of separating Aboriginal children from their families in order to minimize and weaken family ties and cultural linkages, and to indoctrinate children into a new culture, the culture of the legally dominant Euro-Christian Canadian society led by Canada's first Prime Minister, Sir John A. Macdonald. It's a very powerful report. I've put the website there if people wanted to read it. And it's a matter of huge national shame that this was actually a governmental policy with the intention of cultural genocide. So I think it's important for us to recognize that care, can be used in a way to break down people's connections to their roots and to their kinship networks. I think, hopefully, that's not something that's going to happen anymore, but I put it up there just to remind us that within living memory, care has been used in this particular kind of way. Oops. The next slide I'm talking about in terms of thinking about cultural blindness. And I've taken a quote from that in terms of from my clinical work, where when I'm working with cross-cultural placements, speaking to a foster parent around the issue of, and how are you preparing your child for experiences of racism? It doesn't happen here. Okay, so that for me is an example of cultural blindness. So where you may see the difference, but you act like you don't. And I have to say, growing up in Canada, I think sort of cultural blindness was very much the kind of dominant discourse, which is people would say, we're all people here, you know, yellow, purple, green, it doesn't matter, color's not an issue. And although I recognize maybe the positive intent behind that kind of an approach, part of what I've learned is that it does matter, and that there are no purple people. And so this becomes a way of minimizing perhaps wider discourses of racism, which unfortunately are alive and well. And one of the things that it was a quote that I picked up in preparation for today's talk when I was thinking about racism. It doesn't happen here. So for example, if I were running for the American presidential campaign and I discovered that the Ku Klux Klan were going to endorse me, I don't think this would be what I would say in defense, which is that I hadn't done enough research on white supremacists to feel comfortable denouncing them as a group. So unfortunately, I think, yes, racism is alive and well. So I think, how do we move into that area of potentially uncomfortableness of talking with foster parents about the issue of racism when they have a child of color and from an ethnic minority group living with them? And that the colorblind position is not good enough. It's not going to sustain you over time, and it's a bit unrealistic. And so one of the benefits you get from matching children in terms of placements is that other families from ethnic minority groups understand and can prepare children for the discrimination that they're going to experience in the wider community. Some of my best cultural consultant conversations happen with cab drivers. So it's quite interesting if you ask about the experiences of being an ethnic minority taxi driver in Ireland, for example. You get some very interesting views about what happens, about who will get into your cab or not, for example. So it's important that we are able to hear some of the stories that may make us feel uncomfortable as white people. The other quote that I've brought here is from Susan Harris O'Connor's book, which is an introspective study of a transracial adoptee called The Harris Narratives. It's very easy to read. It's quite interesting in terms of her talking about her experience of growing up in America, United States of America, in a transracial adoptive family. And it's really her own stream of consciousness. And one of the things that I think she brings across really powerfully in it is the way in which cultural identity is not fixed. It changes and moves, it's fluid and dynamic, and different aspects of ourselves are more important in different contexts. And so often who I am, which aspect of myself I'm going to be dealing with or sharing, will depend on what context I find myself in. So this is a quote from her narratives. "Love is necessary, but how does the black child, who will eventually grow up to be a black adult, have a chance to love him or herself if he or she is the ongoing target of discrimination? Especially if there's no place for the child and family to go to regularly to get mirrored, validated, and made to see that it is more than okay to be of a blended family. It is critical that white parents be aware that the power of racism is so great that it can sabotage all the time, energy, and love they put into raising their child of color." This slide here, in terms of is a quote again from a black mother to a white social worker. "Don't talk to me, you took my daughter." And I've heard variations of this. I mean, it doesn't just happen in cross-cultural placements. That whole bit about how do you keep an ongoing relationship alive and be able to have the conversations that you need to have when your experience is the person who took the children away. And so what I'm touching on here and what I'm reminding myself about is that we need to find ways of bridging that gap, and we need to find ways into those conversations. And so understanding how your client perceives what you have done is really important. So you need to hear their account. And this idea of having their children taken, having their children stolen, often connects onto wider discourses and narratives that come down through families over generations about children being taken. It's a very, very powerful emotional story about having your children being taken from you. The next piece of theoretical scaffolding that I thought would be helpful, and this is more recent, it's Celia J. Spalakov's work on working with in fact it's with Latino families. She's a family therapist, but she's devised this, what she calls Mecca maps, and it's a really lovely book. It's been recently republished, 2014, so that's not so old. And she talks a lot about the issues of migration, and also about sort of first generation, second generation, third generation. So there's some typical patterns that get manifested over time. And even though it specifically focuses on Latino families, when I've read it in relation to other families, so if I think about Black British families, predominantly they'll be from the Caribbean. If I think about Asian families that I've worked with, so many of the themes that she raises in her book are just as relevant for those families. So what we're looking at is a process, a kind of meta perspective on what happens through families over generations when you migrate. So she puts the family genogram in the center, you can see on this particular slide, and then she talks about discourses of social justice and discourses of cultural diversity. And I think she really starts to get into the complexity about what working cross-culturally actually means. So within what she calls the ecological context, she thinks about community, work, school, and religion, and also then looking at things around migration and acculturation. So she talks there about separations and reunions, trauma, and of course this is an area that I do a lot of work in, disorienting anxieties, and cultural identities. And I suppose it's so important for us to sort of recognize the impact that traumatic experiences have on families, the transgenerational transmission of traumatic experiences, the kind of epigenetic changes that we're actually seeing in relation to, so your traumatic experience may be that you had a parent who had a traumatic experience. It's that powerful, these discourses of trauma. And they are impacting very much if you think about how people have ended up here after long, often very traumatic journeys. On the discourses of cultural diversity, she gets into family life cycle issues. And again, given the work that I've done with young people and adults in the care system, thinking about the life cycle is really important. So part of the things that I say in my work with, it's mostly children in care, is the bit about care is an intervention, not a destination. And I got that idea from working with the adult survivors of the Irish orphanages who were in their 60s and 70s when I saw them. And that bit about how the very small time that they'd spent over the whole of their life in care and how disproportionately damaging it had become. And so this bit about we need to be thinking, I know when I started my career I had probably more rose-colored spectacles, that children would come into care and everything would be all better, it would be all right, as opposed to thinking about what happens when they leave care. So people have talked about 18 So it's interesting. And then what does the research tell us? Is most people who are in care return to their families of origin and their communities when they come out of it. How are we equipping them for that? What happens to them when they become parents themselves? And so the discourse of being in care carries on all the way through the life cycle. And so I think it's so important that we think about that, is that we may not know what we need to know at this point in our lives. And so that's where we need the views of elders when you have a young child saying, I don't want to be in touch with my culture, for example, right now. But it's a bit like, we know that maybe later you probably will. And so it's being able to hold that life cycle perspective, I think, is really important. And I do think we have an ethical responsibility to do that. So there are things around ideals, family dreams, meanings, timings, transitions. All of these are really important. And of course, connect very much to the life story work that we might do with children and their families. And then things around family organization, and we've had lots of examples about how different families organize, and different cultures have different ways of thinking about family organization. So one of the concepts that my black colleagues reminded me of and spoke with me about was this concept of other mothering, and how that was actually a real bonus to have other mothering in your community. So this idea of a nuclear family with one mom, one dad, there are lots of cultures don't actually participate in that kind of a construction of family life. And I'm also really pleased that the issue about attachment theory and its lack of kind of cross-cultural research was brought up, because, I mean, it is very much based on sort of mummy and baby. Dad gets a look in periodically. But, actually most children, something like 80% of the population, live in sibling groups. And we haven't really then extended even some of the attachment literature out into thinking about what it means to be in a large family group. So nuclear, extended family, connectedness, hierarchies, communication styles. So these are all the different aspects that would go into one of Celia Falikov's MECA maps when she's then thinking about a treatment program. So she really gives you quite a lot of tools to start building up treatment interventions that are addressing different levels of the system over time. So if we're building cross-cultural competencies, some people have already raised this in the really stimulating presentations we've had for the, throughout the day. Look, we need to have an awareness of our own cultural values and biases. And often you don't become aware of them until you're actually confronted with the other. And then you think, okay. So things like eating with your fingers, okay? That I wouldn't think about that until I'm confronted with families that eat normally, regularly, and that's the way they do it, and I'm the odd one out. Awareness of your client's culture and values and biases. So that's how you need to find that conversational space to be able to talk about those things. And so often when we're asking, thinking about getting cultural consultants, sometimes we're bypassing the most important cultural consultants, which are the parents of the children. And so you must also think, what must it feel like to have someone brought in as a cultural consultant when you're sitting there as the parent of a child and people aren't asking you? So thinking about culturally appropriate intervention skills. So that's also an important area for development. So I then went through some of the kind of issues that I've put under the heading of multiple contexts and cultural borderlands, because I don't want to oversimplify or say that this work isn't complicated, because I think it really is. So it's important that we identify cultural stereotypes which are there, and that we try and move beyond those cultural stereotypes. And I think it's also important that we work towards holding not an either-or position, but what would be called in family therapy a both-and position. So that sometimes we're holding contradictory positions simultaneously, which can be very difficult. And that also this bit about knowing and not knowing. And so how can you take your ignorance and actually turn it into a resource, which is the respectful curiosity that was mentioned earlier today. So sometimes not knowing can actually become a real asset if you're prepared to engage empathically or authentically with your clients. Balancing strengths and weaknesses, we tend to work in a kind of care proceeding system that focuses predominantly on weaknesses and doesn't do enough about strengths. And that often when we're thinking about the best choice for the child, sometimes there isn't a best choice anymore, and what we're looking at is the least detrimental option. So I think that's also important. We don't keep the rose-colored spectacles on all the time. We need to work much harder at participation and collaboration, and so that can be quite difficult. And the other thing that I then was thinking about was outsider witnessing and shame discourses. It was interesting when I was thinking about that because, of course, when I get asked as an expert to sort of come over, I often have to observe contact sessions. And this notion of shame and shame discourses, it's that I think in general, not only for ethnic minority families, but for all families, having a child come into care often is a very shaming experience. And some parents feel unable to maintain any kind of contact or access with their children because they feel so ashamed of being publicly, if you like, humiliated or deemed unfit parents. But in preparing, I'm sure like lots of people do for things, I decided I would Google outsider witnessing and shame discourses to see whether anybody else had written about that. And oddly enough, I did actually get something that came up, and it was from this very bizarre kind of book called Gaius Scutus, Studies in Antebellum Southern Humorous and Sporting Tales. Like, whoa, that's really weird. But the quote was, and I'll read it to you because it resonated very powerfully for me and probably touched on some of the sadness that I feel in the clinical work that I'm doing. But with the entry of Squire Haney, the tone changes considerably. Soot begins to feel shame. Our appetite to run began to gnaw me stomach, and I felt my face a swelling with shame. I were shamed over Dad, shamed over Mum's bare legs, an open collar, shamed over myself. Soot's shame at having an outsider witness the degradation of his family. Clinically, we know that shame discourses are the hardest to change, and they're the hardest to have with anyone else. So shame is something that makes you just want to crawl away and not see anybody ever again. So I think it's so important that we think about this issue of shame in our clinical work. And one of the things that I have found really disturbing is how children from ethnic minority families, asylum seekers, often children in the care system start to feel ashamed of their parents, and that we're not working hard enough to help them to understand the context and the circumstances and the family experiences, often over many generations, that have led to this family breakdown. So it's really essential that we teach children to understand and develop compassion and empathy for the situation that has led to their parents having to either relinquish or have the children removed from their care. And part of what I've also encouraged people to think about is that we need to work much more actively at trying to return children to their families of origin, if at all possible, or to make better use of kinship care networks. So other thoughts and ideas that I had about thinking about these multiple contexts and cultural borderlands and care proceedings was, and again, people have touched on this today, so that was very confirming for me, is to consider how we apply the threshold for significant harm, and are we applying it equally? So when we get figures and statistics that are telling us certain groups are overrepresented in care proceedings, I think we need to start asking some serious questions about what's going on here. I think we also need to consider how we privilege the attachment discourse, which is that often we're privileging the attachment discourse several years down the line in care proceeding cases, having somehow conveniently forgot that we disrupted the primary attachment that the child came into the world with their mothers. And we also need to consider when we consider life story work should be done and who should do it. So often we're waiting, as opposed to saying, look, it's dynamic, it's ongoing, it's fluid, and why you're in care is such an important question. Who am I? It's an important question, and that we need to stop waiting for some kind of resolution or maybe even revolution before when we start doing this work. It really needs to start almost as soon as the child comes into care. And yes, there may be some questions that you can't answer, like what's going to happen to me, but there are others that you can work on and keep alive. So I'm going to finish with a quote. So this is from the Simmons School of Social Work. It's an organization that works around, they've got a website about working cross-culturally. And this person's quote is, "One of the fundamental skills for emerging social work practitioners involves the capacity to turn, find, face, and embrace humanity in the other. This is very difficult to do for many reasons, one of which is related to the fear of having a truly authentic dialogue. Authenticity requires us to come to the table naked and without shame. But where I come from, if you came to the table naked, you'd really get into trouble. But what I think this person is touching on is this bit about being prepared to be yourself and to really bring yourself into the therapeutic arena and to use yourself as a resource and to use cultural ignorance as a tool to become that kind of respectful curiosity, to open up the dialogue. And probably what's most important is that you're coming to the table. And that's where I want to stop. So.